I remember back when I really got into making videos about abandoned places, I watched a video from Backyard Exploration on an abandoned mall in St. Louis, Missouri. It was a creepy video of a pitch black mall suspended in time with former manicured plants growing out of control. Well, there was of course a long history leading up to its closure, but really it was a relatively unknown mall until this video went viral, and its notoriety was supercharged by the quickly declining state it was left in. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 84th episode of Abandoned, we'll find out what exactly led to its closure and the shocking decade-long decay that has ravaged the property. This is the Jamestown Mall. Today's video is sponsored by Ground News. Get 30% off the Vantage plan by clicking the link in the description below. It was the early 1970s, and in the greater metro area of St. Louis, there were about 3 major shopping malls. They spanned across the greater suburban area of this impressive city, and developers saw an opportunity for even more indoor retail space. We all know the story of how indoor shopping malls were the hot new real estate projects of their time, and they were being built across the United States. Around 30 minutes outside of the city center and just off of US Route 67, the Jamestown Mall was no exception to this trend. In October of 1972, the shopping mall broke ground, and it was a large one at that, with nearly 900,000 square feet of space, along with parking for 3,500 cars. Across this vast square footage would be 90 retail stores, along with 2 big box anchors, those being the local department store chain Sticks Bar and Fuller, as well as Sears, Roebuck & Co. Jamestown Mall opened in October of 1973, being advertised as the big one, with ads boasting about its massive size, modern architecture, live tropical plants, and its year-round 72-degree interior temperature. The mall was an immediate hit, and the property was a convenient shopping hub for those who lived in the surrounding areas. Surprisingly, for such a popular mall, there really isn't a ton of documentation through these early years at Jamestown. In fact, there's only a handful of these vintage photos documented on the internet, and even the local library had little to share with me. Regardless, over the next few years, stores would cycle through the mall with not a ton of changes. Sticks Bear and Fuller would be replaced by Dillard's by the mid-1980s after their buyout. Plenty of community events were held here too, like bear fighting? Okay. Jamestown was by all accounts a successful shopping mall that was well liked by the community, and because of that, lured in a lot of shoppers. The owners deemed there to be so much demand that in 1994, they embarked on a $4.6 million expansion project to add space for 2 more anchor stores, additional retail concourse space, and an expanded food court, which would now feature this really cool looking pink neon lights. Famous Bar and Macy's would occupy these new anchor spots, and by 1998, Jamestown saw yet another expansion, this time to its movie theater. The property had seen a lot of success by this point. However, by the year 2000, things seemed to have reached their peak. In 2003, Jamestown was sitting at around a 30% vacancy rate, which isn't horrible, but it was something to keep an eye on. The same year also saw the sale of the property for $8.8 million to the Carlyle Group. They acknowledged the declining tenancy within the mall and vowed to spend another $60 million in major renovations to bring the property into the new millennium. The million-square-foot mall was also now competing with other shopping districts in the greater St. Louis area, mainly the brand new St. Louis Mills, another million-square-foot shopping mall which opened a mere 9 miles away. It was a new hardwood-lined shopping experience which simply outclassed Jamestown in a lot of ways. Carlyle Group never really acted on the renovation plans, and as more customers were siphoned off to other shopping areas in the city, that vacancy rate continued to climb. By 2006, the mall lost their first anchor tenant as Dillard's announced their withdrawal from the property, citing underperforming sales. In response to this slight downturn in customers, in 2008, the Carlyle Group announced their intentions for the property, with the investments of around $120 million to turn the dying mall into a mixed-use commercial center with offices and a senior living community. This was, of course, right before the effects of the recession, and these ambitious, capital-intensive plans were cast aside, and Jamestown Mall continued its current trajectory. In fact, its reputation only got worse, as 2008 also saw the murder of a woman whose ex-husband shot her inside the mall at point-blank range, then proceeded to shoot himself. This was a really bad look, and it wasn't long after until another anchor tenant, Sears, announced they would be closing down their location. Interestingly, a year later, the county brought in an outside advisory group called the Urban Land Institute. Local government officials wanted something to be done with the property, and this study was conducted to determine why the mall was failing and where it needed to go from here. Their report was comprehensive and showed the mall in a dying state, with the final verdict citing a number of factors that I'll get into later. But the leading consensus was that Jamestown Mall would not be able to sustain a long-term future. A new mixed-use proposal was strongly encouraged to take advantage of the 115-acre site. By 2010, these development plans were actually being taken seriously and presented to the city. Honestly, it was a really great plan and would have greatly benefited the local community. But it became clear that the Carlyle Group didn't have the same enthusiasm to get the project funded. Instead, the mall continued to decline until around late 2013, when it was announced that the property would be shuttered after heating bills were not being paid. On July 1st, 2014, the mall had closed permanently with no real plans on what would happen next. Jamestown Mall was now officially abandoned. It was later that year when people started getting inside the mall, notably Backyard Exploration, who posted a nighttime trek through the closed mall with just a flashlight. Jamestown was frozen in time from the point it closed, just collecting dust with the concourse plants out of control in their overgrowth, which is strangely unsettling. The video made local news, as did many other subsequent intrusions into the derelict structure. The city, meanwhile, was trying to gain control over the land, and by 2017, they successfully did so, buying the remaining parcels for $1.7 million. This officially transferred the ownership of the mall over to the St. Louis County Port Authority. They opened up the possibilities for new development, but subsequently failed to find a developer. As a side note, during this whole time, there were a few bidders trying to buy sections of the mall. One of those unsuccessful bidders was a megachurch pastor named David Taylor, who wanted to purchase the former Macy store and turn it into their church headquarters. But to do that, he was imploring his congregation to donate to the church so they could buy a section of the abandoned mall. Even though during an unrelated deposition, it was exposed that he was already extremely wealthy, driving multiple high-end cars, including a Bentley, and living in a massive mansion. Despite this, he was still trying to use donations to buy a part of the Jamestown Mall. But the city ended up blocking their bid, which caused his church to sue them. I don't think there was ever an outcome to this lawsuit. Anyways, in the meantime, the mall was rotting away. Extensive water damage to the roof had covered the saturated drywall in mold, along with mildew taking over the movie theaters and carpets growing their own ecosystem of moss. There was some vandalism within, but most of the glass entrances were still intact, and even the power remained on. Security was pretty tight in the hands of Carlyle, but that wasn't the case with the Port Authority. Security then became very lax, and more people began gaining access to the structure. By this point, anyone to enter the mall would find the concourses in complete shambles. The paintball-stained walls were the backdrop to a completely disheveled mess of debris everywhere. Across this vast property, only one business remained open, that fittingly being a funeral home. But they were suffering from some problems. A pretty large underwater pipe had burst over the winter, spilling tens of thousands of gallons of water flowing across the Jamestown parking lot and critically cutting off water to the funeral home. The Port Authority, who owned the mall, was apparently very difficult to reach, and after a few days and a news report, the problem was finally fixed. Scrappers had now been taking their toll on the structure, tearing out the insides of the HVAC units on the roof, as well as any copper piping within. Many of the still intact walls within the structure had their surfaces spray painted with graffiti. Fires then broke out in June of 2020, likely at the hands of vandals. Over at the city, well, they had just denied a new bid from a developer who wanted to turn it into a distribution center. Since the site is in a predominantly residential neighborhood, the plan was vigorously opposed by locals. By this point, the city had spent nearly $2 million on the various redevelopment proposals since Jamestown's closure. In April of 2022, the city formed a strategy to utilize some of the money from the American Rescue Plan Act following the pandemic to take the building down. This plan was ultimately approved within the city, allocating $6 million of federal money to demolish the mall. Some more reuse proposals did come up in the months following, but no immediate action was taken. People continued to trash the inside of the mall, with most of it being almost unrecognizable, especially to how it looked just a few years prior. The exterior was suffering too. Perhaps most indicative of the shopping center's long fall from grace was the movie theater sign out front, with the neon letters falling off their mounting points and dangling by wires. Yet another fire was started in early 2023, this time a pretty large one, injuring 2 firefighters and dealing significant damage to the roof of the structure. 2 months later, another fire broke out, this one though at a much smaller scale. Clearly, the situation at Jamestown Mall was out of control, and these recent fires amplified calls for action, since by this point, it had been more than a year since the funding for the demo had been approved. Finally though, on September 26, 2023, demolition on the Jamestown Mall had officially begun. Crews began at the now infamous dangling sign over the cinema, ripping through the massive structure. But of course it wouldn't be so easy, as after day 2 of demolition, the workers went on strike. The building was left with a massive hole in the side of it, and of course, yet again, it caught fire. However, since it was an active demolition site, the nearby fire hydrants were turned off, and firefighters just let it burn itself out. The road to get here has obviously been tedious, and for local leaders and residents, extremely frustrating. Jamestown Mall, even from the very beginning, really should have never even been built. If you look at it from the sky, it's completely surrounded by low-density, single-family housing. Its main frontage is on a relatively low-density street and has no signage along the highway. The amount of people needed to sustain a local mall like this just wasn't there, and this was reinforced in that 2009 advisory report, which stated that the county had around 65,000 to 115,000 less residents in the area and 100,000 less workers in the area than what was needed to sustain a shopping center of that size. Not to mention that for decades the overall population in the St. Louis area had been declining. This was all on top of the oversupply of commercial real estate. In fact, this was even being pointed out back in the 1970s, with this map showing all of the local and major malls being built in the St. Louis area. There was just too much competition, and with Jamestown Mall out of the way for many of the regional shoppers, the long-term viability was never looking great. Coupled with bad press, online shopping, and not keeping up with maintenance, it makes sense why this property closed for good. Truly, its closure was an inevitability. But then there's also something to be said on how long it took to find a new use. The lack of action taken by the Carlyle Group may have sealed its fate, but even after it was closed, at least it was somewhat maintained and secured. The Port Authority purchased the land with seemingly no concrete plan of action and allowed people to get inside and absolutely tear the place to shreds. So you gotta sympathize with some of the frustration locals have had with the never-ending course of inaction. I mean, almost $2 million of taxpayer money was spent on just the exploratory campaigns for redevelopment, not to mention the purchase of the actual site. It took city leaders fighting for a slice of federal COVID relief money just to fund the demolition of a structure. And even that took a year before the wrecking ball would even slam into the walls of the building. It just seems like this whole thing was poorly executed from the very start. And it makes it even worse that it was all for a shopping center that probably shouldn't have even been built in the first place. Here on this channel, we're always discussing bankruptcies and changes in the retail landscape, like this news story of Kroger and Albertsons selling a huge chunk of their stores to Piggly Wiggly's parent company, C&S Wholesale Grocers. I read a lot of news for these videos, and this one in particular, politically at least, it's a somewhat objective story, but it's still important to see who's reporting on it and how they're doing so. That's why I've been using this video's sponsor, Ground News. I think it's incredibly important to get the most informed picture of what information you're consuming. We're humans and we're all susceptible to bias, especially in this political landscape. But Ground News packages this information in a neat and easy to comprehend format that's all data-based. It shows you how each side of the political spectrum has reported on the story, what direct comparisons there are, how trustworthy those news organizations are, and who they're owned by. I specifically love Blind Spot, a feed that outlines news stories that may be missing out on balanced reporting. I truly can't recommend Ground News enough, and they've given me a special link that will give you 30% off their Vantage plan, which will give you a few unique features, including your own news bias, so you can actually keep track of your news diet. If you want to help this channel out, as well as an independent news organization that is trying to make news more transparent, you can go to ground.news/brightsunfilms or click the link in the description below. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.